Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlight Series. Today we look at Benchmark 1.5, in which we will describe how British policies and responses to colonial concerns led to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. In Part 1, we will trace the causal relationships between British policies, British responses to colonial grievances, and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. These policies include the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Declaratory Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, and the Intolerable Acts. So we will focus on these causal relationships, looking at the idea that what the British government imposed on the colonists compelled the colonists to complain, to petition the British government for some kind of relief, and then we focus on the British responses to those petitions and complaints and how that all impacted the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So how did British policies affect the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and how did British responses to colonial grievances affect the writing of the Declaration of Independence? So how did British policies affect the writing of the Declaration of Independence? On this slide, we're going to be looking at two laws that were enacted in 1765. These laws were enacted by the British government, but they affected only the colonists. The first of these laws was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that all printed materials be taxed, which would include newspapers, pamphlets, bills, legal documents, licenses, almanacs, dice, and playing cards. The money that was collected from the tax went directly to England. So you can see from this list of the types of printed materials, newspapers, that's a way for us to stay informed. Legal documents, that would be something relating to a contract perhaps, such as buying or selling property or buying or selling goods or services. Licenses, the idea that somebody might need a license to practice law or to practice medicine, that type of document also required a stamp. Even dice and playing cards, for people to play dice with each other or to play card games with each other. In order to do that, they had to pay an additional tax besides the price of the dice and the price of the playing cards in order to be able to purchase those items. And the colonists were naturally upset about this because they were not consulted about why a particular tax was being imposed upon them. The way that they were not consulted was that they did not have representation in the legislature. And because they did not have representation in the legislature, they could not give their point of view about whether or not the tax should be imposed, what the impact of the tax would be, or anything else relating to the tax. So that's where the consent comes from, is being able to play a part in the decision making. That doesn't mean that a person gets their way, but at least they wanted a voice in the discussion and the decision making, which they were denied. So we see that the Declaration of Independence says that the king abused his power by imposing taxes on us without our consent. The king imposed taxes on us without our consent. The Quartering Act allowed the British government to house its soldiers on colonial military bases and in public houses, including inns, barns, and other buildings. So here the colonists had no say whether or not the British military would be on their property, on their land. It was British land because we were colonists. But still, they had no say in whether or not the British government was there, but yet they had to house their soldiers, whether it would be on colonial military bases that had been established just for the colonists, or in public houses, such as inns, barns, and other buildings. So inns, barns, and other buildings might be houses that were set up to help the poor or to keep animals or other kinds of things. So the Declaration of Independence says that the king abused his power by quartering large bodies of armed troops among us and is kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, meaning that the colonists had legislatures, they had state legislatures and lower government level legislatures, and they were not even asked what their point of view was about whether the British government could come in, even when there was no conflict, could come in and to be housed on military bases and in public houses, etc. And so naturally they were quite upset about this. And now we continue our focus on the impact of British policies on the writing of the Declaration of Independence, focusing on the Townshend Acts from 1767 and the Tea Act from 1773. The Townshend Acts taxed imports to the colonies. The Townshend Acts were passed by the British legislature, which did not include colonists. So that means that if the colonists wanted to import particular goods, fabric, food, tea, military equipment, etc., they had to pay a tax on that import to the British government. And so we see this issue being reflected in the Declaration of Independence by saying that the king abused his power by refusing to, quote, pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. So here, the focus is that the large districts of people are the colonists. So the king refused to pass laws to accommodate, to support large districts of people unless those large districts of people would deny themselves having any voice in the legislature, which is something, from their point of view, is something that only tyrants do, not people who live in a society that believes that the people should have a say in how they are governed. Now, what about the tea tax? The tea tax was passed in 1773. And what the tea tax did was to give to the East India Company, which manufactured and distributed tea, the sole right to sell tea in the colonies, which the colonists did not accept. A high tax on the tea being sold by the East India Company was also imposed. This meant that the colonists could not buy tea from any other country or from any other company. And the tea that did come into the colonies was taxed. So the colonists had no choice in the tea that they purchased. And then even without that choice, they had to pay an additional tax on top of it. And so here in the Declaration of Independence, we see the same idea being reflected that we discussed when we talked about the Townshend Acts, that the king refused to pass laws to accommodate the colonists, the large districts of people. So this idea that the colonists were being imposed upon and had no say in their government, they believed was against the common principles of what government should be in terms of an exchange of ideas between the people and their government and an exchange of loyalties between the people and their government. So how did British responses to colonial grievances affect the writing of the Declaration of Independence? Well, first we should look at the preamble of the Declaration, which includes that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, God-given rights, that cannot be taken away by government, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And so in essence, what the Declaration of Independence is saying is, this is how we've been governed, and we do not consent to it. And so what else do we see going on in terms of this British response to colonial grievances and the different policies that Great Britain passed? One is the Declaratory Act, which repealed the Stamp Act. British responded to the colonists protesting the Stamp Act, demonstrating that the act did not deserve their consent of the governed. So in response to the colonists grieving, meaning filing a grievance, saying that they were unhappy that they had no choice about which tea to buy and they had no choice in being taxed on that tea, that the British responded with the Declaratory Act. The Intolerable Acts from 1774 were laws intended to punish colonists because they protested the tax on tea by dumping the tea into Boston Harbor. This is what we know as the Boston Tea Party. Now, we often think of a party as being a pleasant event, but this wasn't pleasant at all. This was a protest by saying, if the only tea that we can buy is the tea from the East India Company and it's highly taxed, we would rather live without our tea than to accept these terms. And so consequently, the Intolerable Acts were passed because of the British response to the Tea Act. Thank you so much for joining me today. Do you still have questions? If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining us.